not this particular reform, so well, it's hard to think of something that needs reform.
I didn't.
Well, we'll start with taxation. April 23rd. Important days on Americans. Well, April 15th is an important day. It's when income tax. But April 23rd is when singled out, as I said, as tax day. This is from previous years, which is why it doesn't quite match up. But for 2024, April 23rd is Tax Freedom Day. What that means is, according to the estimates of a certain group that keeps track of this, the money you make in the year until April 23rd, that's what you pay in taxes. And then the money you make the rest of the year, that's the money you can keep. That's not exactly how it works out, but percentage-wise, that's what they're trying to calculate on average. And if you find that depressing, I refer you back to the What Government Does page you did earlier this year. April 15th or the 23rd is a good time to think, what am I getting for my tax money at the national, state, local level? When is the last time you've been invaded by a foreign military?
1812.
Maybe, or 9/11, depending on what you, I guess that's not foreign military.
Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, Pearl Harbor.
It's not invasion.
And so that's a good thing. I think we'd be happy that that's the case. And we generally seem to like driving on roads and things. And all those other things are going to do. So whenever you find yourself feeling resentful of taxes, you develop an instinct.
You look right.
What are you doing that for? But still, it's not a completely affectionate relationship. If we want to take the high ground on taxes, we can go with former Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who said taxes are what we pay for civilized society. If we want the lower road, the art of taxation consists in so plucking the goose as to obtain the largest possible amount of feathers with the smallest possible amount of hissing. That was a French finance minister, Colbert, back in the 1700s. That's the east. Well, with that said, let's look overall. State by state, that's in a decade ago. I think back then Utah was about the 21st slowest. So we were kind of in the middle, but on the downside of the middle. So here are some features of our federal income tax. First of all, it's big. The federal tax code is 2 thick volumes, and there's not much of a plot. So I don't know how many people have actually read through it, but I feel sorry for them.
Reading.
And then, that's just the legislation. Then there are the regulations, sort of the Talmud to the Torah, in religious terms. The regulations fill 8 thick volumes, that's about 1.5 feet of shelf space. Again, no plot. And in fact, in the decade between the simplifications of the Reagan presidency and 1997, so between the 80s, 1997, about 15 years, there were 4,000 amendments to the tax code, a rate of more than 1 a day. It's not such an issue anymore, but about 20 years ago, it was estimated that 300,000 trees were needed to make the paper for the 8 billion pages of tax forms that were used that year in the country. Now, more of it's done online, but still, that's a lot of size. The tax code is also quite complex. Hundreds of thousands of accountants and tax attorneys do nothing but try to navigate this maze of the federal tax code on behalf of their clients, whether they are individuals or corporations. So, for example, Chrysler Corporation's 1991 federal return was a stack of papers 6 feet high. A team of 55 in-house accountants worked on nothing else all year. And 9 IRS auditors worked on nothing else but auditing previous versions of Chrysler's corporate tax. Of course, the cost of preparing taxes is billions and billions of dollars. And so it's quite a thing. Now let's see once again how it got to be this way. Sort of a quick history of the income tax. There are many reasons to tax. The first reason is to raise revenue. The government needs something to operate on. And so that was the main reason behind our first federal tax. Now, Team Point, what was that tax? Before that? The tariff of 1789. Income taxes are very late arrivals. From the beginning until the arrival of the income tax in the progressive era in the early 20th century, tariffs were the main way the national government got money. With the brief exception of what?
Bonds.
Embargo.
The Civil War. There was a temporary income tax during the Civil War, because the government needed more revenue than tariffs and other sources. So tariffs will raise revenue for government operations. That first tariff was very small, only about 5% on imports. But it's mixed with the second reason, which is to shape trade. Our second major tariff, the tariff of 1816, was an average of about 15 or 20% on imports. Not so much because government needs had risen, although they had some, but because the British were trying to flood our markets with cheap imports and dominate our markets. So in the second tariff, there's a consideration that American manufacturers need to be protected from British competition. And through the rest of the 1800s, as some of you are having some Bush nightmare flashbacks, there are perpetual arguments about how high should the tariff be. And so usually the Whigs and Republicans want it higher to protect manufacturers more, and the Democrats want it lower, but it's still pretty high. They just want it not quite so high, because they don't think it needs to be that high. As we've seen earlier, when tariffs are charged, it protects domestic manufacturers, but at the expense of not just foreign competitors, but consumers. Because the prices of products get more expensive when there's a tariff field. So, Rule 1800 is the age of the tariff. Now we'll see later on the other two reasons. Taxes can regulate behavior, especially those sin taxes. And redistribute wealth. So those are the big four. Transfer payments is a nickname from taxing the rich and giving to the poor. So there's the age of tariffs. And as you can see, sometimes they got really quick up, 50% and above. And even after the 1913, maybe our highest tariff in the 1930s, what was that?
Smoot Hawley.
Smoot Hawley. And since for the most part, we kept the tariffs very low in the nineties and beyond, they got even lower until the recent Trump tariffs on China and some others. He's proposing 25% tariffs, I don't know if proposing is the word, maybe threatening 25% tariffs on Canada, Mexico. There was an attempt to bring about an income tax in the 1890s, but it was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court because the Constitution says taxes have to be direct. Head taxes and income taxes aren't head taxes, they vary depending on income. So here's that rejected income tax proposal driven out of the government. So our next step in the history is the origin of the income tax. The income tax was pushed by progressives. In fact, the progressive income tax was pushed by progressives because, as this is trying to show, it's putting a treadmill. A progressive tax compels the rich to pay more of their income than the poor. So it's not just the same rate on everyone, and the rich pay more because they're richer. It's that the rates get higher the more income you have, but it's sequential. And so you pay the lower rate on the first part of your income, and then the next rate kicks in on the next part of your income, and on up, as long as your income lasts you until you get to the higher rate. This seemed more fair to progressives than tariffs, because tariffs are regressive taxes. They wind up being the same rate, more or less, for everyone. Well, it's kind of a consumption tax, but it eats into the income of the poor more than the rich. They favor some over others. So a progressive tax might seem fair or unfair to you. Adam Smith, the economist, said the subjects of every state ought to contribute toward the support of the government in proportion to the revenue which they respectively enjoy under the protection of the state. That seems to support a progressive tax, but that last line is important. Under the protection of the state, part of the reasoning of the progressive tax is that the wealthy enjoy greater benefits of the government. Since they have more property, they benefit more by the country not being invaded. Since they're often involved in business, they benefit more from the roads, not just personally, but for their business, to get resources and to ship out their products. And in various other ways, access to resources. There may be greater benefit from what the government's doing. So for it to happen, we first of all had to get which amendment?
16th Amendment.
You were just waiting for that one.
Yes.
I almost didn't ask you because I thought there would be some campers. When? And then the income tax was passed in 1913. Interestingly, the original income tax bill is only about 15 pages long, which as tax bills go is pretty short. Because the original income tax was not that complex. There's a progressive part to it, compelling the wealthy to pay their share. But there's the original 1040 form, one page. And you pretty much declared your income and saw how that fit under the percentages. And in fact, the first income tax was only on the rich. If you made less than $3,000 a year, you paid nothing. And that was the great majority of Americans at the time. By the way, when the income tax was passed, the tariff was significantly lowered. And so it's a rebalancing in a way of government revenue. And then, if you made $3,000, $20,000, you paid a whopping 1% of your income. And it would go up to 7%, depending on how much above that you made. 7% was for incomes over 500,000. And So who paid the most that first year?
JP Morgan?
Rockefeller.
Senior or junior?
Senior.
Senior. John D. Rockefeller Senior paid $2 million in income taxes.
What?
There's a reason he's the richest American ever. Keep in mind that his wealth before 1913 was untaxed.
I wish I had that money.
And that's in $1913.
How much would that be now? Wait, how much do you think that'd be now?
More.
Oh, yeah.
How much more?
So we start seeing those with money trying to minimize their income so that they don't pay as much tax, a natural consequence of income taxes. And even starting in some ways to offshore some of their wealth if they can, to push some of their activities to other countries where it wouldn't be taxed at such aggressive rates. But strangely enough, there were also cases of early taxes of some people lying about their income so that they could pay income taxes. Either because they were just patriotic or progressive and wanted to do their part, or if they paid income taxes, well, you know, they could complain, oh, I had to pay those ghastly taxes, those terrible taxes. What you're saying is, I made more than $2,000 last year. What do you do?
That's 7%.
So the first income tax was pretty simple, but it will start evolving pretty quickly. Taxosaurus. It didn't take long. World War I came on. The United States didn't enter until 1917. But when it did, the effect was dramatic. The minimum level of taxation was reduced to $1,000. Still not a majority of Americans, but a much bigger group. It was about 13% of the labor force. So it's starting to reach into the middle class. And the top rate went from 7% to 77%. Now again, be careful, that's just the top earnings of the wealthiest Americans. And even those wealthiest will pay lower rates on the beginning of their earnings. But the highest income of the richest Americans is being mostly taxed away here. Those rates got lowered under Secretary of the Treasury Andrew Mellon in the 1920s. Sort of our first supply side tax reductions, lower taxes, especially on the wealthy. The theory is that when you reduce taxes on the wealthy, they'll use some of the money they're saving to stimulate the economy. They're businessmen, they'll invest in their businesses or other businesses. And so overall production of the economy will increase. And one of the consequences of that is, even though the tax rates have gone down, the government might take in more tax revenue because the economy is bigger. There are more profits to tax. So we see some of that in the 1920s, although it doesn't have all the theories entirely attached to it yet. And the wealthy are getting better when they want to at sheltering their income, but also more laws are being passed, starting to create exemptions and loopholes, ways you can shelter some of your income. Then the Depression came, and with it came big government deficits. The taxes couldn't keep up with the amount the government was spending. No one liked it. Of course, Herbert Hoover didn't like it, being somewhat conservative on finances, but neither did Franklin Roosevelt. In fact, one of his campaign slogans in 1932 was attacking the big deficit that Hoover's government had piled up in its last year, and seeming to suggest that he would be more responsible in balancing the books. Well, that didn't happen. This was Big Depression. But what kind of economic theory became more popular?
Keynesian.
Keynesian. What do we have, 4 and 2? By the way, trickle down's a synonym for supply side, having taxes on the rich, the benefits will eventually trickle down. So, these are two significantly different approaches, not just for government revenue, but for the economy in general. Keynesian economics, named after British economist John Maynard Keynes, says, okay, if this is total economy, let's say this is what the wealthy are bringing in a given year, and this is the rest of the economy. According to Keynes, the government will tax the wealthy more and redistribute to those who are less wealthy. So the wealthy lose this slice, and those who are less wealthy get a little more. The other thing that's going on is the government is deficit spending so that demand will stay high even though the economy is falling. And so you can call it demand side. It's reallocating what's already out there. And if the economy is getting bigger, it's because the government is deficit spending, and that will presumably have to be paid back later. Come back around the other in a few decades. World War II brought the Revenue Act of 1942. This tax act was now 208 pages long. And most of it was either defining or closing loopholes, shutting some doors, opening some others. The top tax rate, 91%.
Whoa. That's like.
What do you mean? There's a war going on. You want the Nazis to win?
I want my bag.
The World War II was the first time that most Americans needed to pay income tax, so they lowered the minimum. And it's also when the government started withholding income taxes. And so they take it out of your check rather than you paying it all at the end of the year. And after World War II, loopholes, shelters, exceptions, exemptions. In a way, what happened with the income tax in the 20th century is what happened with tariffs in the 19th century. Since tax rates are a main way governments show economic favoritism, many people are always interested in them, and so they're constantly lobbying their representatives to get them changed in ways that benefit them. But also sometimes it's hoped in ways that benefit the country. So do you know what some of the biggest federal tax exemptions are, or exceptions?
I wouldn't see it for you.
What's that?
Charitable organizations.
So charitable organizations don't have to pay tax as long as they meet the requirements. And on the individual level, if you itemize your taxes, you don't have to pay tax on charitable donations, what you give to charity. Now that's thought to be the public spirit to help charities, but it's using the tax code to favor that kind of behavior. Another big exemption is on interest paid on mortgages. So the loan you get to buy a house, whatever interest you pay on that loan, you don't have to pay taxes on. Again, using the tax code to try and promote homeownership, which is thought to be a desirable thing. These are ways in which the income tax are not just getting money for the government, but trying to influence behavior. In the 1970s, the economy was lousy and confusing, and there was pretty high inflation, and so there was what was called bracket creep. Because of inflation, you were being paid more usually, but it didn't feel like you were making more because the price of everything was higher. But because you were getting paid more, sometimes your income was in the next highest tax bracket. So maybe you've been paying 15% before, but now your higher income is taxed at 25%. So that bugged a lot of Americans. And just the whole economic situation seemed difficult. All of this set the stage for who?
Ronald Reagan.
Ronald Reagan. Who gives us significant tax reform that comes in two waves. But essentially, by the time it's done, personal income tax rates will be slashed down to 15 and 28%. And again, there's a minimum, so those who are fairly poor don't pay anything. But many will pay 15%, and the wealthy will pay 28% on their top income. So Reagan's seen as a big tax cutter, but at the same time, he was doing that, he was also sort of broadening the tax base. These acts will also eliminate certain loopholes and exemptions so that more people will have to pay than before, even though the overall rates are coming down. But on the whole, tax rates came down, and here's where we see supply side in its biggest operation. So the theory is here you have your rich and your poor again. But if you cut taxes, especially on the rich, the main effect is the economy grows, which means the rich get more pie, but so do the not rich. More pie for everyone.
Yay.
But the danger is, what if the theory doesn't work, not so much with the economy, but about government revenue? Theory is, if the economy grows, even at lower tax rates, the government will take in at least as much in taxes from the bigger economy. That didn't happen during the Reagan years. And we start getting our first big national deficits. Well, World War II got some impressive deficits, but we always get big ones in wartime. Our first big peacetime deficits. Now that may be because that theory of supply side doesn't work. Maybe the government doesn't take in as many taxes. But we didn't get a true trial of it during Reagan's presidency, because at the same time he's lowering taxes, what else?
Increasing spending on military stuff.
So, government spending didn't come down. In fact, overall it went up, despite what Reagan said about cutting the size of government. So in his presidency, he piles up $1 trillion in debt. Now, that may not sound like much now when we're approaching 36 trillion overall. But it had taken our whole history as a country up into the Jimmy Carter presidency to accumulate our first $1 trillion national debt. So when Reagan added another trillion plus in 8 years, that was a big deal. And George Bush the First will add more than another trillion in his 4 years. So by the early 90s, there was considerable concern about deficits and debt, and of course, regarding taxation as well. Another big tax moment. Oh yeah, the other question about supply side is it's also called trickle down, because the idea is while the rich benefit first, since their rates are cut the most, the economy will get bigger and more productive, and that means lower prices for products and more jobs for more people, so the benefits will trickle down to everyone eventually. On the whole, it's the other one. That doesn't seem to have happened. The benefits of the increased economy, I don't know how I diagram this, seem to go to the rich. Their incomes have gone up significantly since the 1980s. The incomes adjusted for inflation of the other parts of the economy are either staying the same or declining a little. Now, some would say, well, that's because the rich are the ones who are dynamic here. They're seeing the opportunities, they're taking advantage of them, and in the process, they're growing the economy. Others will say, no, the system is stacked against the poor now. It's leaning in favor of the rich. That's why they're doing better. That's one of the main arguments between conservatives and liberals. I forgot to say that before Reagan, there was also revolt against taxation at the state level, especially in California. An initiative was passed, limiting property taxes in the 70s. But here's our next big tax moment. George H.W. Bush was the heir apparent at Reagan near the end of his presidency. But there were two concerns about it. One was he wasn't conservative enough. He was too much of a wishy-washy moderate, unlike Reagan. And secondly, he wasn't tough enough. Strange for a decorated pilot in World War II and former CIA director, but just in his personality, he didn't seem as decisive as Reagan. So that led him to make this famous promise in his campaign in 1988. The overall arc of the speech said, if I'm elected, people are going to come to me and they're going to say, Mr. President, the deficit's getting too high, you're going to have to raise taxes, and this is happening, you're going to have to raise taxes, and this, and you're going to have to raise taxes. And I'm going to look at them and I'm going to say to them, read my lips, no new taxes. Now I said that to address both concerns about it. That's paraphrasing a movie character of those years. Clint Eastwood's Dirty Harry, vigilante cop. And so he's trying to look tougher here. And then he's trying to look more conservative. Keep taxes low, cut taxes. Early in his presidency, things went well. The first Persian Gulf War, he suspended the war. But late, we had a recession and between fighting war and continued low tax rates. What happened to the deficit? It ballooned. Historically high levels. This is why you can get more than $1 trillion in 4 years of presidency. And what did George H.W. Bush do?
He
raised real rate.
And did it help him?
Nope.
It helped the country.
Right? But he lost to Bill Clinton all the same. Bill Clinton raised taxes again in 1993, but then later in his presidency cut rates again. And Bill Clinton got the perfect tone. After the deficits of the Reagan and Bush years, Bill Clinton for 4 years presided over surplus. The government took in more money in those years than it spent. Now we've already seen the first reason. He raised taxes some. Why else did we have surplus under Clinton?
He cut spending.
Cut spend, why could he cut spending? Old war ended. We didn't need to spend as much as we had on the military. Clinton's a Democrat, so normally you think he raised spending, but he was a pragmatic Democrat, and so he worked with Republicans on things like welfare reform, which reduced some entitlements and knocked some to the state level. And the economy was booming. It came out of that recession and did very well in the 90s, so there's plenty of revenues. I'd say it's funny to think back at it, but I guess it's really not funny. During those years, there was serious debate about what are we going to do with the surplus. Some people said, well, we should just cut taxes more because the people are overpaying the government. Democrats often said we should use it to help Social Security. Because that was a growing threat. There were surprisingly few people who said, well, let's just pay down the national debt with it. Because that was already trillions of dollars, so why not work on that? Well, for those 4 years, and it went into the election of 2000, that was a serious issue. And then the dot-com bubble burst, and we had a recession, the stock market crashed. Went back into deficit, and we haven't had to worry about that issue ever since. But it's almost quaint to think back when the total national debt was maybe $4 or $5 trillion. We really thought, okay, maybe we're at the end of this debt cycle where we can start reducing it now. Well, definitely didn't. What happened instead was almost a perfect storm the other way as far as deficits and debt went. Why did the debt or the deficits get so big under George W. Bush?
War on terror.
9/11. We've got to spend a lot of money on the war on terror. It's like another Cold War. Why else?
You cut taxes?
We did. Another supply side type round of tax cutting. So revenues were down. It's kind of like Reagan. Tax rates are going down, but military spending is going up again. The economy was often good, but there was a big recession, the Great Recession, at the end of his presidency. And then, even though he's a Republican, he spearheaded a new benefit program. Team Point, what was that one?
No child left behind?
That was one of his programs, but it doesn't cost a lot. Medicaid what? Oh no, it's not Medicaid. Medicare what?
Plus.
Medicare prescription drug benefit. So lower prescription drug costs, especially for seniors, and that will cost a couple $100 billion a year. And it's almost an ideal situation for ballooning annual deficits and therefore the national debt. Nixon, back in the 1970s, when he was talking about the economy, he was asked about Keynesian economics since he was a Republican. Generally, Republicans frown on Keynesian economics. But Nixon said back in the 70s, oh, we're all Keynesians now. And we see that with the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. What Nixon probably meant was, we all believe in counter-cyclical spending, which means when the economy goes down, government spending should go up so that the recession doesn't become a depression. The increased government spending will keep the economy afloat. We saw that from both sides. George W. Bush was in favor of massive relief programs to the economy in 2008 before he left the White House. And Barack Obama, when he came in, was in favor of massive aid programs to the economy when he came in. The good news is, those programs, and there were various, saved many companies, many banks from failing, and quite possibly kept the economy from going into depression. The Great Recession is big, but it's far from the Great Depression. The bad news is it piled up a lot of debt that we'll have to deal with somehow in the future. Well, Donald Trump, taxes up or taxes down?
Taxes down.
Taxes down again, so that's gonna help whoever benefits from supply side tax cuts, but it's gonna add more to the deficit and debt. Joe Biden, taxes up or taxes down?
The same.
The same. Do not undo Trump tax reforms, and we'll see what Donald Trump will do in this next term. It seems at the very least he'll continue the rights, which you passed first term, which are set to expire. But we'll see how it goes and who will benefit from any additional tax cuts.
Adam,
The future probably not.
so then you want to air it?
Oh, yeah. Higher tariffs definitely on China. Let's see what Canada and Mexico have to say, and are negotiating, talking, trying to get a better deal on our current working arrangement. But keep in mind, one of his biggest campaign issues was inflation and high prices. What the Americans were unhappy with in the economy. So, some of you talked about different tax systems in your reform. Not as many as usually. Value-added taxes, flat taxes, land taxes. In Georgia, there are other ways to do it. For some reason, there hasn't been a lot of momentum. But the government always needs money to run on, and sometimes we use taxes to try and achieve other goals. Well, I don't want you to miss your opportunity late in class. Similar to what you did